A atividade desta manhã consistirá na condução da mesa temática número 1, cujo tema é os Acordos Internacionais do Clima, Segurança e Desenvolvimento. Convido os palestrantes, professor Dr. Franziskus Von Lucke, da Universidade de Tübingen.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, my name is Franz von Lucke. I'm a researcher based in Tübingen, Germany. It's a very small but nice little university town. First of all, thank you very much, Rubens, for inviting me to this very interesting seminar here. And I think it's very good to talk about these issues here in Brazil. And well, I've worked for some time now on climate change, and especially on climate change and security. I also did my PhD on this topic in a postdoc later in Tübingen. So yeah, I have some experience in this field, and now I'm going to talk about, well, the connections between climate change and security on a global level, but also I will include some case studies. Yeah, my talk will be structured. First, I will give you a little overview of the kind of the evolution of the debate of the connections between climate change and security on a global level in the last couple of decades. Then we will dive a little bit into theory and understanding what securitization means, how that works out, how that is connected to climate change. And then I will give you a few empirical examples from the US, Germany, and Mexico, how climate change was securitized very differently in these countries with different political consequences. Yeah. Let's start the evolution of the climate security debate. I would say that the connections, the first discussions about climate change and security started in the 1970s, kind of linked to these discussions about the limits of growth, but also to the discussions on climate change in general. But the climate security debate really started out in the 1980s and 1990s. So first, it was embedded in a broader debate on environmental security, where the ozone layer played a role, also forest dieback, acid rain, these issues and so on, and how they were connected to conflict. That this was a discussion, but then increasingly this was connected to climate change, and climate change became a bigger topic within this environmental security or environmental conflict debate. There were also the first politicians in the late 1980s that tried to frame climate change as a security issue, sometimes to get more attention for the issue, to kind of really get political initiatives through parliaments and so on. There were also NGOs starting to recognize the link between climate change and security, and trying to make the case that this is something important at the international level. And also the first newspapers talked about climate security. You see here the cover of a quite famous German weekly newspaper saying the climate catastrophe, and this is from 1986. So the debate started quite early, actually, and then branched out. So after the 1990s, I would say that climate change became much more central in these debates. So in the 2000s, climate change and security really, this debate really took off. So there was a huge social scientific debate on the connections between climate change and security, but also very importantly, several think tanks took climate security issues and issued several quite influential reports on that. Also, the US Defense Ministry, the Pentagon, issued a report in 2003 on abrupt changes in the climate systems and its connections to national security, which was quite well received and talked a lot about. So already in the 2000s, there was a lot of talk about climate security. It also then entered the UN system. So in 2007, there was the first a debate in the UN Security Council on climate change and its repercussions for international peace and security. Since then, there have been many debates at the UN level, many resolutions of the UN Security Council on climate security and so on. And I will tell you a little bit later more on that. And of course, also at the COPs, the conferences of the parties, climate security became an issue. It was very important at the 2009 Copenhagen summit, where the climate security debate had a first peak, I would say. However, it then went down a little bit again. Climate security discussions were revitalized, I would say, in the 2010s. Not least due to the climate youth movements. So Fridays for Future, Greta Thunberg, Extinction Rebellion, The Last Generation. There were all these social movements that try to, again, bring climate change onto the agenda. And they also used the climate security framing. So they also introduced new vocabulary, for example, climate crisis, the climate apocalypse, or Greta Thunberg's famous speech on our house is on fire. So these issues became more and more common in these debates, and these framings of climate change became much more common than just saying climate change or global warming. So now it's often the climate crisis, the climate emergency, and so on. So here again, security came into the debate. Also, climate security by now plays quite a big role in the discussions about the Anthropocene. So the idea that humans are now kind of a main driving force of changes in the Earth's atmosphere and the whole Earth. So kind of coining a new era starting out from the Holocene, and now we are in the Anthropocene, so humans as the main force here. I've also edited a book on that, on climate security in the Anthropocene, which could be interesting in that regard. I would say now in the 2020s, climate security really has consolidated. The debate is really mainstream. So climate security is being discussed at the highest political level. So again, at the UN level, there have been numerous debates in the UN Security Council. There have also been now certain institutionalizations of climate security. There's a so-called climate security mechanism at the UN level. There's a group of friends of climate security. So all these things kind of systematically are now dealing with the security impacts of climate change on a global level. Also, several foreign ministries, defense ministries around the world, they now recognize climate change as a very important topic. They're included in national security strategies and so on. So climate change, I would say, really is is increasingly becoming an important topic in these issues. Of course, also NATO has founded a Center of Excellence on Climate Security in 2023, and organizations such as the European Union also are recognizing climate security in several of their reports. Also, Secretary General of the UN, Guterres, in 2019, famously said that humanity has opened the gates of hell. So really coining the climate change as a very important risk, as a very important threat that has to be met with all the appropriate countermeasures. So yeah, climate security really is center stage by now, I would say. However, now let's do a little bit of theory, because I'm not only going to talk about climate security, but about the securitization of climate change. But first of all, how is climate change discussed as being connected to security? I would say that there are 4 different pathways how climate change is connected to security in the literature, in the discussion. The first one is climate change leading to more extreme weather events, disasters, and so on, which could lead to climate migration, international or internally in countries, which is being discussed as could leading to conflict. The second pathway is climate change leading to droughts, to desertification, and so on, which could lead to resource scarcity, water shortages, food shortages, which again could lead to conflict. The third pathway would be climate change as contributing to a thawing Arctic, the ice in the Arctic, so freeing up resources, freeing up shipping routes, which again, in the end, could not only lead to economic gains, but also to international tensions, conflict, and so on. Who can get these resources? Probably this is going to be a quite complicated issue now with what's happening in Russia and so on. So these things also could lead to conflict. And the last pathway is kind of ironically that also the measures to do something about climate change, to mitigate climate change, so transformation of energy production to more green sources has also a conflict potential, because if you build huge hydro energy projects, huge wind farms, and so on, this could displace people, which could lead to protests, local protests, resistance, and so on, which again could be connected to conflict. However, as I said, these pathways to conflict are quite contested. So there is no clear causal mechanism. We have climate change and now we have more conflict, but it's much more complicated. And I have analyzed climate insecurity from a securitization perspective to kind of do justice to these contested debates on climate security. What is securitization? Securitization is kind of based on the idea that threats internationally, political threats, are not just out there. You cannot just search for threats and they pop up, but they are socially constructed. So within certain discourses, within certain speech acts of elites, things are recognized and framed as security issues that have not been security issues before. So just as it happened for climate change, at first it was an environmental issue, now it's talked about as a security issue. And this is not just due to the nature of climate change, but also due to the political processes. And securitization theory tries to understand this. So basically, the main idea of securitization theory is that we have a securitizing actor, usually a politician, elites, and so on, who kind of propose an existential threat for a valued referent object. So, for example, for the state or for the people and so on. And then we have an audience that has to accept the speech act. So the politician says, well, the environment or the climate change is a huge threat to our national security. And then the audience, which can be parliament or the general public, either accepts the speech act and then it grants politicians extraordinary measures to counter this threat, or it does not accept the Speech Act, then there are no measures. So this is the classical concept of securitization. However, the research on securitization has gone on, and there has been new development how to understand securitization. And I would say the most important new ideas here are that there are multiple securitization discourses. So it's not just single elite speech acts and not just one particular way how you can securitize issues, but you can do it very differently using different conceptions of security. And in the end, this matters greatly for the political consequences. And also the second new development is that it's not only about granting someone extraordinary countermeasures to stop this threat, but securitization can have very diverse consequences that not always have to be very extreme, but still influence how issues are dealt with politically. So if we look at the climate debates, we see that we have very different conceptions of security that are connected to climate change. So for example, national security, human security, or risk conceptions. And I would argue that it makes a huge difference whether you use national security or human security or risk when talking about climate change for the political consequences. So the kind of the theoretical model I'm using for the empirical studies I will present in a short while is kind of are structured between three different discourses of climate security: national security, human security, and risk. So you see on the slides that kind of they are distinguished by looking at different referent objects. So national security really looks at the state, at a certain territory, and so on, and proposes certain threats that could threaten, national security. The human security discourse, on the other hand, it has not the state as its referent object, but humans, individuals, how they are affected by the threat of climate change, which I would argue makes a huge difference when it comes to the consequences on how climate security is dealt with. And the last conception is risk, which is a much more diffuse version of security, which looks at it in a more kind of a statistical way and so on, and it again has different political consequences. And after the theory, now let's dive into a little bit more empirical findings. I have compared in a study the United States, Mexico, and Germany when it comes to the securitization of climate change. I've looked at the debates between 1989 and 2020, and let's see what's different in these cases. So, first of all, the United States. First of all, in the United States, there had been a quite long environmental security debate in the 1990s, which then gradually transformed into a climate security debate especially in the 2000s. And what discourses were dominant here in the United States? Here, the United States actually is a clear example for a securitization based on the national security discourse. So climate change really was securitized as a direct threat to national security, as a direct threat also to the US military, affecting mission environment, affecting their bases, affecting their training exercises, affecting how they would deal with humanitarian disasters and so on. So this was really at the center stage of the securitization process in the United States. And also when we look at referent objects, it was really about the US territory, the military, the state, international order, and so on. And the most important actors in this securitization process were these defense and security-oriented think tanks, which I already mentioned, but also the military itself to some extent. So especially retired military personnel in the United States, they cooperated with these think tanks and actively and participated in the securitization. They wrote reports on climate security and really brought it into the debate also at the defense level in the United States. The idea was really to sensibilize the military that climate change is not something they could ignore because it will affect their mission environment and so on, all the things that are important. But also, of course, the securitization in the United States was kind of a way of getting more attention for climate change. So because, of course, if you talk about climate change as a security issue, as affecting national security, you will get hurt. So people will find that more pressing, more interesting. So this was also an important thing, I think, part of the debate in the United States. So what were the political consequences of this particular form of securitization, which was based on national security? First of all, I would say that it led to a politicization of the climate debate. So talking about climate change as a threat to national security in the United States, gained attention for climate change. It, to some extent, helped to bridge divides between Republicans and Democrats. So conservative audiences were more keen to listen to what was being said about climate change because now it was increasingly discussed as a security issue, as a national security issue. And that was an important aspect of the debate. However, because climate change was really securitized as a national security issue, I would say that the main impact was not politically on the political level, but rather on the defense and security level. So there was as I call it, climatization of the defense and security sector. So increasingly, all the military branches in the United States and several of the intelligence branches and so on, they began to talk about climate change. They integrated climate change into their planning. So the quadrennial defense reviews in the United States, they included climate security, the national security strategies, the national intelligence estimates. They all now include climate change as an important aspect. And also some roadmaps by the Army and the Navy in the United States, they now include climate security as important aspects. And I should say the Navy is especially eager in the United States to deal with climate change. And they have been doing a lot of research on climate change, actually, because they have so many ships going around the world and so on. So for them, climate, weather, these things have been very important for a long time. And they have been very active now on climate change. So I would say that this was the main impact. If you talk about climate change as a national security issue, then it will mainly have or often have an effect on the defense sector, on the security sector, which in the United States still was very important, I think, to raise the political profile of climate change. It also, I would say, had an effect on empowering certain actors and disempowering others. So this focus on national security, on defense and security in the United States really pushed think tanks working on defense issues. They now became important voices in the climate debates in the United States. And at the same time, NGOs, which have not dealt with security a lot in the past, they were kind of marginalized in these debates, which I would say was also to some extent problematic because, of course, climate change is not only a national security issue, but also has human security aspects and so on. And I think these were a little bit less discussed in the United States. But let's go to the next case, to Germany. So here we saw a very different form of securitizing climate change. So here the focus was more on human security and risk conceptions, and national security did not play a big role in Germany. So the focus was really on climate change as a threat to human security, also as a more diffuse risk conception, partly as an affecting international security. And the threats and risks were the direct physical effects of climate change, especially on poor populations. And the debate in Germany was also quite particular in focusing a lot on poor and vulnerable populations in the global south, because politicians, NGOs, think tanks, and so on at that time said, well, climate change is very bad, but probably it will affect us less because we are able to adapt. We have enough money, we have enough political capacity to adapt and so on. So it will mainly affect populations in the global south. This has changed a lot in the last couple of years because people have realized, well, it's not only affecting the global south, but it's also affecting us. But still, at that time, the securitization was really much human security of people in the global south. And the actors were much more diverse than in the United States. So it was parliament, it was church organizations, NGOs, and so on. They all participated in the securitization of climate change, in constructing it as a threat to human security and as a long-term risk which had to be dealt with. Accordingly, due to this very different securitization of climate change in Germany, we also have different political consequences. So in Germany, I would say that the effect on climate policy and on development policy, for example, was much more pronounced than in the United States because it was about human security. In the end, it also affected kind of the development policies of Germany, but it also affected a lot the climate policies in general. So framing climate change as a human security issue helped to get several initiatives through parliament and so on, several laws on climate change. So it had a huge impact. It boosted Germany's climate policy. And it also kind of boosted a huge sector on risk management, climate insurance schemes, and so on. So this was connected to this idea of climate change as a long-term diffuse risk and so on. So we had a very different form of securitization in Germany, which led to very different political consequences, which were not so much in the defense sector. Now, the German defense sector as well has begun to talk about climate change, but still is much less important than, for example, in the US. And I would say that is partly due to this very different form of securitization. But let's now go to the last case, Mexico. Here we had a much weaker form of securitization in general than in the two other countries. So climate security debates in Mexico only started quite late in the 2000s. The focus was similar to Germany on human security and on risk, but very interestingly, national security, well, did not only not play a huge role, but was actively rejected by Mexican authorities at that time. I will say a little bit more on that when we come to the political consequences, but that was a very particular finding in Mexico, that national security and climate change was not really discussed. The referent objects in Mexico, according to the human security and risk conception, was vulnerable populations within Mexico, certain risk groups, risk areas in Mexico, and the main actors were parliament, President Calderon, and also some foreign think tanks, RUSI from the United Kingdom, and also the UK embassy, actually. They also tried to push climate security in Mexico, which, however, in the end failed. So about the political consequences, as I said, it was a rather weak securitization in Mexico. So the consequences were not as pronounced as in Germany or the United States. So there was some impact when it comes to politicization. So climate security was to some extent helping to wrap up or gain attention for climate change, but it was very much kind of combined with a more general framing of climate change as an economic and justice issue. So these things were more important than security in Mexico, I would say. The securitization also had some impact on civil protection, so impact on certain civil protection laws and so on. It was integrated into the disaster management schemes, the national development plans, the Sistema Nacional de Protección Civil, national risk atlases, insurance schemes. These things played a role in Mexico, but still that the impact was not huge. When it comes to actors, it was NGOs that got kind of empowered to speak about climate security to some extent in Mexico, talking about human security in these issues. But most interestingly, in Mexico, as I said, there was a quite clear-cut rejection of climate change as a national security issue. So as I said, this UK think tank, RUSI, and also the UK embassy, they really tried to frame climate change as a national security issue in Mexico. However, the Mexican authorities really kind of understood that as an infringement on their sovereign right to do do security policy in Mexico. So they were afraid that these actors coming from the outside would interfere in internal Mexican security issues, and they were very reluctant to accept this form of securitization of climate change. So they didn't want to talk about climate change as a national security issue. They were open to talk about it as a human security issue. And here we see again that how you talk about climate security, which discourses you use in securitizing climate change make a huge difference when it comes to consequences and how countries, how institutions and so on react to this talk about climate security. To conclude, I would say that now the climate security nexus has been established on the highest political levels around the world, including militaries, defense sector, intelligence community. So there has been increasing talk about climate security, increasing an integration of climate threats, climate risk into the planning documents of these institutions. Of course, other issues can be much more important than for example, geopolitical tensions, now the tensions with Russia and so on. These things still trump climate issues within these in this sector, in the security defense sector, but still climate change has become important. It is mentioned in many important reports, so it will not go away, I would say. And then the second finding, I would say that, as I said, there is not one unified way how climate change is securitized, but there are very different discourses of climate security, national security, human security, risk, international security. There are even more. I won't go into that now, but I would say that it really makes a difference how climate change is securitized. And it really makes a difference when it comes to political consequences, how the whole debate is accepted. For example, there have been debates, as I said, in the UN Security Council on climate change. And I have also looked into these debates, which countries were in favor of really talking about these issues and which were not. And often there was a lot of resistance when it comes to talking about climate security as a national security issue, because countries were afraid that then there would be interference and there would be something coming, especially from northern actors, Western actors, interfering into their security politics, into their sovereign right to do in the security sector. But they were much more open to talk about climate change as a human security issue. So here again, it's very important how you frame climate security. And also, I would say, when we come to a normative assessment, how do we find the securitization? Do we think that it's a good thing? Should we securitize climate change or not? I would say that here again, it's very important how you do it, how you securitize climate change, which security conceptions you use. I wouldn't say that national security is bad and human security is good. That is a much too simplified notion. It really depends on the country. It really depends also on how these security logics are operationalized. So national security can be operationalized quite differently. So it can be about I don't know, border controls. It can be a very narrow defense-oriented view, geopolitical tension, and so on. But it can also be, there are also broader conceptions of national security that do include also how humans are affected, so that are much broader and much more open to debate and so on. So I would say that you cannot really say that one security conception is bad and one is good, but you have to consider what you say. You have to consider how you talk about climate change, and you have have to really be aware that using specific conceptions of climate security has and will have very different consequences politically. And I think this is a very, very important finding and should be kind of kept in mind when talking about climate security. So thank you very much.